one of the things people reference is like, because there's so many VFX heavy projects, like sometimes the quality of the VFX, there's a lot of things at play here too. Like we have gotten better at identifying it. So like our mind is not blown the same way when we see something. We're watching a lot of films like superhero films where we're seeing things that aren't natural to real life. So it stands out more. But it seems like there's been like, if I don't want to pick one specific movie to rag on, but like if you look at reviews for, certain MCU films, people go like, how do they have $250 bajillion into this project? And then, this looks like not as good as Jurassic Park's, this shot. Why do you think we're seeing more VFX that don't seem to, I guess, hold up when we're watching like newer projects that have a lot of money dumped into them, big teams, a lot of experience? Like, why do you think audiences are seeing the cracks and seams a lot more, it seems like, with newer releases?
Well, I think you kind of definitely hit the nail on the head as far as like there's more exposure, right? Like in the 80s and 90s, visual effects was not really like, it was kind of obvious too, but like Jurassic Park was like a magical movie. Like we're like, I don't know how they did this. Like I don't
It's
even
magic.
I probably don't even own a computer myself at that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Let alone am I thinking that's fake, that's digital, like that's an insane that's just magic, right? Movie
Yeah.
magic. Nowadays people do freaking TikToks, man, and they're like, yo, I want to add an explosion in the background. Boom, explosion, done. Cool. I did AI tracking on my phone, explosion back there. Like, awesome. Like, so I feel like that is a big curse, I think, a little bit, right? Because they're like people kind of have they feel like they know what they're talking about in
They at
some
least can
ways.
say like, oh, that was green screened. They'll throw out
They
like
know what
some
green screen
basic thing.
is.
Yeah.
They know what a green screen is, right? I think that's a huge thing. I think shows like VFX Artists React, you mentioned Corridor Digital. I freaking love those guys. They're fantastic, and what they've been doing for the VFX industry has been awesome.
Yeah.
Really shining a light on a job that's really hard to explain to most people.
Yeah.
So I think that's really cool. But that also kind of shows people like, oh well, I didn't. And they start to become like little, armchair experts, if you will. Also another great podcast, but nonetheless. But
Shout out Dax
yeah, I
Shepard.
mean, but for real though, like but I think they do a good job of explaining why it's good or why it's bad, right? And that's what I love about that show. It's like they don't just say it's good, they don't just say it's bad, they actually show you with a demo of like what's going on and what makes it great or bad. But I think also there's just so much volume, right? So I think like all art, it's unfinished, right? Like to a degree, especially in the business, right? You only have so much time. How many MCU movies are they releasing? How many MCU TV shows are they releasing? I mean, shit, I just made a list for myself because I'm trying to catch up. I'm like, there's like WandaVision, there's Falcon and the Winter Soldier, there's like all these different shows, all these different movies. It's a lot of work. And honestly, there's only like they try to stick with a lot of the same studios, but there's only so many people, right? So your teams tend to get a little smaller potentially, or they get more stretched out, or they just don't have enough time. And so that's a huge aspect of it, right? Because in order to have that volume, you've got to do more studios. And honestly, I would argue that there's probably less studios now and less artists, at least active now, than there were at the start of the pandemic, like pre-pandemic, because there were a lot of studios that shut down completely. So there's that affects the market, right? And there's just so much work going on that like it's insane. I mean, I know studios right now where there's producers that are on like 5 or 7 shows at a time. Like that's a lot to keep track of, right? Stuff's gonna fall through the cracks. You're trying the best that you can, but it's just nutty, man. Like there's just so much work going on. So I think there's a lot of that. The volume of work and the time frame that it needs to be done, I think, is usually a pretty good reason why something may fall off the curve, right? But I mean, it also depends on who's in charge, who's at the helm of it too. They may just have a different creative vision where they're like, hey, I kind of want it to look a little hokey or a little bit. I don't want to say hokey, that's a bad word, but like I want it to look a little bit more
Hyper stylized
fantastical or stylized. That's not necessarily realistic. That is going to ping on people, right? But even when you do realistic stuff, I think as humans, we know what's real, what's not. Like we have
see it every day.
we're really good at that. So that anytime you try to do hyper realistic stuff, like for instance, with Star Wars has done this a lot, and they've even done it more recently. Yo, real talk, that's a crazy one because Mandalorian, they did that Luke Skywalker bit. Spoilers, yo, if you haven't seen Mandalorian, but that was a while ago. That initial Skywalker bit, and it looked good, But you knew, I'm like, well, and that's again one of those things like, I know Mark Hamill's not young. I
Mhm.
know he's old. He looks good, but he's old.
Yeah.
And B, like it just you could tell that something was slightly off.
Yeah, it's like the
Now,
Irishman same problem, you know.
oh
It's
my
good
god,
work, but we know what Robert De Niro looks like really well because he was in a
that's a
lot of
huge one.
movies.
Now I
Yeah.
will say to that point, I believe it was in Boba Fett. They doubled down. This is like, oh, you like Luke Skywalker? I'm
Yeah.
gonna give you a whole episode with young Luke Skywalker, and you ain't gonna be able to tell shit.
Yeah.
And oh my god, dude, like from literally like it must have been like less than a year in time as far as like advancements. And again, mind you, this stuff is getting worked on, and it usually is done well before it releases. Sometimes it's not. I've
And there's
literally
an
worked
army
on
of nerds
episodes.
working on it in their basement, fixing
Yeah,
it, sending it to them, going like,
yeah,
look at
yeah.
this, do this. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but literally, that was such a huge change where it's like, hey, I already know young Mark Hamill's not a thing, but I did not even think about it in those sequences because it looks so good.
Mhm.
Like it looked so realistic. And again, you're talking about the uncanny valley, right? Anything that looks almost too real that it seems off
Yeah.
is a real thing that we fight a lot in visual effects. But yeah, I think when you go down that lane, it can be challenging. I mean, I worked on Cry Macho with Clint Eastwood, and there's
Mhm.
a lot of de-aging going on in that as well. And again, like that's not something like we didn't go extreme. Like it wasn't the point was not to go extreme. The point was to make him look more like late 70s instead of like 90. You know,
Really? There
I don't
so
know if
there
you
was
knew.
no, I
Yeah,
had no
there's
idea. The
yeah.
invisible
So there
effect.
was some DH work going on there.
Interesting.
It wasn't meant to be extreme, you know. I mean, Clint Eastwood's Clint Eastwood, man. The dude's a goat. Like he's good, but there was some work done, and it was a lot more subtle, you know. Um, so I think there's stuff like that that is a little bit more effective, right? Because they're not going too extreme, like you're talking about with Irishman, man. Like you know, De Niro may look like he's 40, but he's still curb stomping that dude like a 90-year-old man would
Yeah.
curb stomp
And
a
he
dude, you
doesn't
know.
look like De Niro when he was 40. You know what I
That
mean?
too, yeah.
But yeah, and yeah, but it's interesting to see how it develops. I was just curious to know kind of your perspective on that. Coming from that world, and I like it's why I like VFX Artists React. It's why I like having conversations like this because it's easy to be the armchair expert and go like, oh man, that doesn't look good, you know. And then you like when you start hearing like Cry Macho and you start hearing like, oh, there was de-aging stuff done in that where it's like I had no
Yo,
idea.
real
Like,
talk. I'm gonna talk about that real fast. The freaking rooster, Macho, in that movie was like that was some insane shit. So like, so I don't know if like I know so much weird shit about things like fighting roosters now. Like I'm not like I don't do cockfights, but you know like there's options, right? So roosters have talons. Very famously, if we remember Napoleon, does it have sharp talons or whatever? Like you know like that's a thing. And I didn't even think about this. And so a lot of times, like they either keep the talons and they sharpen them for cockfighting, or they cut them off and they duct tape little metal replacement talons, right? And they fight each other. It's graphic. It's messed up. Cockfighting sucks. But the stunt rooster that they had for the production didn't have talons. So for whatever reason, they wanted talons. So like legit, there's like probably 45 or 50 shots where we had to digitally add digital talons to this rooster and properly light them, track them to the actual rooster's legs for every single scene that you see his legs. Like just crazy stuff. Like, and I guarantee you, anyone who watched Cry Macho wasn't thinking like, "Yo, man, those talons, that shit looks fake." Like, I know
yeah.
talons, and those talons, that ain't real. But like things like that, and I guess to whatever reason, Clint Eastwood and to the producers, it was a big story point. They wanted him to have actual talons,
Mhm.
and so yeah, and then like initially they had the metal talons, so we had to remove the metal talons and then add actual
Jeez
talons
Louise.
and like what the initial cockfighting scene. So it was
That's
crazy. So
that's funny because I
yeah,
saw
there's a
your
lot of
credits and I
stuff
was
like
like, what does Cry Macho have in it? It's like
well,
literally
and then
just
there's
went out and
that.
shot.
There's a lot of like little production fixes, reflections, like little things was another one where there was just a lot like every detective movie, you got to wear those cool sunglasses and drive that super sweet muscle car that's got all the chrome everywhere. And you know what sunglasses and chrome is good for? Picking up crew in the reflections. And so yeah, I mean literally we had to like paint out reflections of crew in almost every single shot with the sunglasses or the bumpers and stuff because you can see them. There was period work because it was meant to be set in the 90s, although I don't know necessarily that really came across in the movie, but it was meant to be set in the 90s. So like for instance, all the freeway signs, they use reflective paint on freeway signs now. This is very common nowadays. That's why when your headlights hit them, you see it real easy. But in the 90s, and it's crazy because you can still see this, by the way, they were illuminated with lights underneath, right? And you'll still see them there. They're just not on. So we had to go through, and every time they're driving on the freeway, we had to adjust the freeway signs to look like that dark forest green and give it that like illumination look from underneath so that it looks like it's being illuminated by lights instead of your headlights hitting it. Little things like that.
Yeah.
Little things, ironically,
Yeah.
the name of the movie. But yeah, there's a lot of that.